Picture a calm old man, minding his own business, sipping his morning coffee at a quiet diner. Now imagine a group of arrogant outlaws bursting in, looking for trouble. What they didn't know, this wasn't just any old man. This was a legendary sharpshooter who had spent decades mastering his craft. What happened next will leave you speechless. The early morning light spilled into the roadside diner, painting the checkered floor with soft golden hues. It was the kind of place that time forgot. Cozy, worn and brimming with the scent of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon. Behind the counter, an elderly man sat alone at a corner booth, his posture relaxed, his expression serene. His hands, weathered but steady, cradled a steaming mug of coffee. His name was Henry Carter, though most folks in the area just called him Old Hank. To the locals, he was a retired rancher, a man who had lived a quiet, unremarkable life tending to his farm. But hidden beneath his calm exterior was a past that few knew about. A past filled with precision, discipline, and countless stories that would make even the bravest men shiver. The diner was nearly empty that morning, save for the regulars who frequented it. Marlene, the chatty waitress, bustled between tables pouring coffee and swapping pleasantries. A radio played softly in the background, its crackling tunes blending with the clinking of dishes. The piece was interrupted by the unmistakable roar of motorcycles. 5 bikes, their chrome glinting in the sunlight, pulled into the parking lot with a thunderous growl. The riders dismounted, their leather jackets adorned with menacing patches. They were outlaws, notorious for stirring up trouble in the small towns they passed through. Their leader, a tall, wiry man with a snake tattoo winding up his neck, pushed open the diner's door with a force that made the bell jingle sharply. The outlaws swaggered in, their eyes scanning the room like predators sizing up their prey. The regulars quickly lowered their gazes, the air growing thick with unease. Only Old Hank seemed unaffected. He remained seated, his eyes fixed on his coffee, as though the intrusion were nothing more than a passing breeze. But beneath his calm demeanor, something stirred. Decades of training and instincts honed in the most dangerous situations were awakening. He knew trouble when he saw it, and trouble had just walked through the door. The leader of the gang, Snake, as the tattoo on his neck suggested, strode to the counter with an air of authority. His sharp eyes darted around the diner, assessing each patron as if deciding who might put up a fight and who wouldn't. Behind him, his crew spread out, their boots echoing on the tiled floor. Marlene, the waitress, forced a smile as she stepped behind the counter. Her hands trembled slightly, but she tried to mask her fear. "What can I get you, gentlemen?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tension. Snake leaned in closer than necessary, a grin spreading across his face. "Coffee, strong, black." "And quick," he said, his voice a low drawl. He turned to his crew. "What about you boys, hungry for more than just coffee?" The men laughed, a harsh, unsettling sound. One of them, a burly figure with a jagged scar running down his cheek, scanned the room, his gaze finally landing on Hank in the corner booth. He nudged Snake. "Look at this one, boss. Doesn't even flinch." Snake turned, his grin fading as he studied the old man. Hank hadn't moved since they walked in, his fingers still curled around the mug of coffee. His eyes, however, were sharp, unwavering. There was no fear in them, only a quiet strength that seemed to unnerve Snake more than he cared to admit. "What's the matter, old-timer?" Snake called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "Cat got your tongue?" The other patrons exchanged uneasy glances, silently willing Hank to stay quiet. But Hank, calm and composed, finally set his mug down. The soft clink echoed in the tense silence. He adjusted his glasses and looked up, meeting Snake's gaze head-on. "Just enjoying my coffee," Hank replied, his tone even, almost dismissive. "Didn't know I needed to explain myself." Snake's lips twitched, his irritation barely concealed. "You've got some nerve, Pops. I like that. But let's see if you've got anything else besides nerve." The gang's laughter rang out again, but it quickly died down when Hank pushed back his chair and stood up. His movements were slow, deliberate. The light streaming through the diner's windows caught the silver strands of his hair and the deep lines etched into his face. Lines that told stories of a long life, of battles fought and survived. "I'd rather not cause any trouble," Hank said, his voice steady. "But if it's trouble you're looking for, I promise you won't like what you find." The room fell silent, the tension so thick it seemed to press down on everyone present. Snake's crew exchanged uncertain glances. This wasn't the reaction they were used to. Most people cowered, begged, or tried to placate them, but this old man didn't flinch, didn't back down. It was unsettling. Snake, however, was not a man to back away from a challenge, especially not in front of his men. He took a step closer, towering over Hank. "You're a real funny guy, aren't you? Think you're some kind of tough guy?" he sneered. Hank didn't blink. "Not tough, just experienced." The response, delivered with calm confidence, made Snake pause. There was something about this man, something he couldn't quite put his finger on, but Snake's pride wouldn't let him back down. "Let's see how experienced you are," Snake said, reaching for the chair opposite Hank. He spun it around and sat down, leaning his elbows on the table. "Tell me, old man, what kind of experience are we talking about here?" Hank's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, though his eyes remained cold and calculating. "The kind that teaches you to pick your battles carefully," he said, "and to know when you're outmatched." Snake's jaw tightened. His crew shifted uneasily, sensing the shift in power dynamics. Marlene, still behind the counter, clutched the edge of the counter so tightly her knuckles turned white. Snake leaned back, trying to regain the upper hand. "Outmatched, huh? You've got some big talk for a guy pushing 80. 82, Hank corrected. His calm demeanor, his refusal to be intimidated, was beginning to chip away at Snake's bravado. The room seemed to hold its breath as the two men stared each other down. Finally, Snake broke the silence with a laugh, sharp and humorless. "You've got guts, old man. I'll give you that. But guts don't mean much when you're staring down a gun barrel." At that, one of Snake's men, the one with the scar, reached for his jacket, revealing the butt of a pistol tucked into his waistband. The unspoken threat hung in the air like a storm cloud. But Hank didn't so much as blink. Instead, he glanced at the pistol, then back at Snake. "You'd be surprised how often that mistake's been made," he said quietly. "And how many times it didn't end well for the other guy." The words, simple yet loaded with meaning, sent a shiver through the room. Snake's grin faltered, just for a moment. There was something in Hank's voice, a weight, a certainty that hinted at stories untold, at a past far more dangerous than anyone could have guessed. Snake leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You think you're scaring me, Pops? You've got another thing coming." Hank's gaze didn't waver. "I'm not trying to scare you," he said, "just giving you a fair warning." The room remained tense, every eye fixed on the unfolding standoff. Even Marlene, who had seen her fair share of trouble over the years, had never witnessed anything quite like this. The Outlaws were used to being the predators, but for the first time, they looked more like prey. The standoff between Hank and Snake continued to hold the diner in a vice grip. For all his posturing, Snake couldn't shake the feeling that the old man across from him was more than he appeared. Something in Hank's calm demeanor, his unflinching stare, was unsettling. Scar, the man with the jagged scar, couldn't take the silence anymore. "Come on, Snake," he said, his voice loud and grating. "This guy's all talk. Let's show him what happens when you mess with us." Snake raised a hand, silencing Scar with a glare. "Easy, Scar. We're just having a conversation, right, old man?" he said, his tone laced with mock civility. Hank took a slow sip of his coffee, his movements deliberate. He set the mug down and looked at Snake. "Conversation, sure. Though it seems to me you're the only one doing the talking." Snake's grin returned, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. He leaned back in his chair, drumming his fingers on the table. "You've got a smart mouth. I'll give you that. But I've seen plenty of guys like you think they can stand up to us. You know where they end up?" Hank raised an eyebrow. "Enlighten me." Snake leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low growl. "In the ground." The room grew colder with the weight of his words. Marlene's breath hitched, and the other patrons exchanged uneasy glances. But Hank didn't so much as flinch. Instead, he tilted his head, as if considering Snake's words. "Interesting," he said, his tone as steady as ever. "Because I've seen plenty of guys like you, too. Loud, cocky, always looking for a fight. You know where they end up." Snake's jaw tightened, but he didn't reply. "Behind bars," Hank continued, his voice calm. "Or in the ground, just like you said." "Funny how that works, isn't it?" Scar stepped forward, his hand drifting toward his pistol. "That's enough out of you, old man," he snapped. Hank's gaze shifted to Scar, and for the first time, there was a glimmer of steel in his eyes. "You should think carefully before you draw that," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "because if you do, you won't get a second chance." Scar hesitated, his fingers twitching near the grip of his pistol. The confidence he'd walked in with was rapidly eroding. He glanced at Snake, waiting for his leader to make a move. Snake smirked, though it was clear the situation was beginning to slip out of his control. "You've got a lot of nerve, old-timer, but you're bluffing. You don't have it in you." Hank leaned back in his chair, his movements relaxed, almost lazy. "You're welcome to find out," he said simply. The tension in the room was unbearable. Even the faint hum of the diner's refrigerator seemed louder in the silence. The other patrons sat frozen, their eyes darting between Hank and the gang, waiting to see who would make the first move. Finally, Snake let out a harsh laugh and stood up, pushing his chair back with a scrape. "You've got guts. I'll give you that," he said, his tone mocking. "But guts won't save you." He turned to his crew. "Come on, boys. Let's show these fine folks why they shouldn't mess with us." The gang began to spread out, their boots thudding against the floor as they moved to surround Hank. Scar pulled his pistol, spinning it in his hand with practiced flair. "What do you think, Snake? Teach him a lesson." Snake's grin widened. "Oh, I think that's exactly what we'll do." Hank sighed and shook his head, as if disappointed. "I tried to warn you," he said. Then, in a flash, he moved. The chair he'd been sitting in toppled over as Hank stood, his hand darting to his belt. The sound of leather against metal echoed in the diner as he drew a revolver, the silver barrel catching the light. It was an antique piece, worn but well maintained, and in Hank's steady hands, it was as deadly as anything modern. The gang froze, their bravado vanishing in an instant. Scar's pistol was halfway up when Hank aimed directly at him. "Don't," Hank said, his voice a low growl. "You're not fast enough." Scar hesitated, his hand trembling. He glanced at Snake, who looked equally stunned. None of them had expected this quiet old man to be armed, let alone so quick. Snake recovered first, his eyes narrowing. "I think you can take all of us," he sneered. Hank didn't blink. "I know I can." The confidence in his voice was unshakable, and it sent a chill through the gang. For the first time, they realized they were outmatched. The diner fell into an eerie silence, as Hank's revolver remained trained on Scar. The sharp tension hung in the air, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Snake's cocky demeanor cracked further under the weight of Hank's unflinching composure. Scar's hand slowly moved away from his pistol, his fingers twitching in defeat. Hank's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Smart choice," he said, his eyes fixed on Scar. "Now let's keep it that way." Snake clenched his fists, stepping closer. "You're playing a dangerous game, old man, but I don't scare easy." Hank turned his head slightly, his gaze locking onto Snake. His expression softened, almost pitying. "You should," he replied, "because you don't know who you're dealing with." For a moment, Snake faltered, confusion flashing across his face. Then he barked a laugh, trying to reclaim the upper hand. "Oh, I get it. You're one of those guys, huh? Used to be something big, and now you're just a washed-up nobody hiding in the middle of nowhere." Hank said nothing, his silence unsettling. But it wasn't Snake he was focused on. His sharp eyes flicked toward the window, scanning the reflection in the glass. A glint of movement caught his attention, one of the gang members creeping toward the back door, trying to get the drop on him. With a speed that seemed impossible for his age, Hank spun and fired. The deafening crack of the revolver shattered the quiet, and the gang member let out a yelp, his knife clattering to the floor as he clutched his shoulder. The room erupted into chaos. Patrons screamed, diving under tables, while the gang recoiled in shock. Snake snarled, his bravado giving way to raw anger. "You're dead, old man," he roared, pulling his own weapon. But Hank was faster. His revolver snapped towards Snake, the barrel steady despite the chaos. "Drop it," Hank ordered, his voice cold and commanding. Snake hesitated, his finger hovering over the trigger. For the first time, he saw something in Hank's eyes that gave him pause, something dark and unrelenting. "Who are you?" Snake demanded, his voice shaking. Hank took a step forward, his weapon unwavering. "Hank McGraw," he said evenly, "and if you had any sense, you'd recognize the name." The mention of his name sent a ripple through the gang. Scar's eyes widened, his bravado draining away. "McGraw?" he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "As in the sharpshooter." Snake's brow furrowed, his confusion deepening. "Sharpshooter? What the hell are you talking about?" Scar swallowed hard, taking a step back. "The Hank McGraw. They used to call him the Phantom of the Plains. Served in the war. Never missed a shot. Took out entire enemy units single-handedly." Snake's expression hardened, his disbelief battling with the growing fear in his crew. "That's just some old war story. Nobody's that good." Hank cocked his revolver, the sound sharp and deliberate. "Want to find out?" he asked, his tone icy. The gang froze, their confidence shattered by the revelation. Even Snake, who prided himself on being fearless, seemed to shrink under the weight of Hank's reputation. The man before them wasn't just a farmer, he was a legend. A ghost from a time when survival meant being faster, smarter, and deadlier than the next man. The diner door creaked open, drawing everyone's attention. Sheriff Dalton stepped inside, his boots heavy on the tile floor. He took one look at the scene. Hank standing firm, his revolver trained on Snake, and the gang trembling in fear, and let out a low whistle. "Well, looks like I missed the fun." Snake's head snapped toward the sheriff, his eyes narrowing. "This is none of your business, lawman." The sheriff adjusted his hat, his hand resting casually on his holster. "Oh, I think it is. You see, I know Hank here, and if he's pointing a gun at you, I'm guessing you earned it." The tension in the room shifted again, the gang realizing they were now outnumbered in more ways than one. Snake's grip on his weapon tightened, his pride warring with his survival instincts. Hank didn't move, his revolver still locked on Snake. "Walk away," he said, his voice low and steady. "Before this gets worse." Snake hesitated, his teeth grinding in frustration. He glanced at his crew, who looked to him for direction. But their fear was palpable, their confidence shattered by the realization of who they were up against. Finally, Snake let out a curse and lowered his gun. "This ain't over," he spat, his voice venomous. "You'll regret this." Hank didn't reply. He simply watched as Snake gestured for his gang to follow him, their retreat clumsy and disorganized. They stumbled out of the diner, their footsteps heavy with defeat. As the door swung shut behind them, the sheriff let out a breath. "So you've still got it, Hank," he said with a grin. "Guess they didn't know who they were messing with." Hank holstered his revolver and turned back to his coffee. "They do now." The diner slowly came back to life after the gang's retreat. The clatter of dishes, the murmured conversations, and the faint hum of the jukebox replaced the oppressive silence that had dominated moments ago. Hank returned to his seat, his revolver now secured in its holster, and picked up his cup of coffee as if nothing had happened. Sheriff Dalton pulled up a chair across from Hank, shaking his head in disbelief. "You sure know how to make an impression," he said with a chuckle. "Didn't think I'd see you dust off those old skills." Hank raised an eyebrow, taking a sip of his now lukewarm coffee. "Didn't think I'd need to," he replied. "But trouble has a way of finding me, even out here." The sheriff leaned back, his expression turning serious. "Trouble's been finding this town a lot lately," he admitted. "Snake and his gang have been pushing further into our territory. They're not just passing through anymore, they're setting roots." Hank's gaze hardened, his fingers tightening slightly around the handle of his mug. "That's so." Dalton nodded, his voice lowering. "They've been shaking down businesses, harassing folks. Most people are too scared to fight back. I try to keep things under control, but I'm just one man, and they've got more men out there, more than you saw today." Hank didn't respond immediately, his thoughts turning inward. The image of Snake's sneering face, the cocky swagger of a man who thought himself invincible, lingered in his mind. He'd seen men like that before, men who thrived on fear and took without consequence. They'd existed in the war zones he'd once called home, and now they were here, poisoning the small town he'd come to for peace. Across the diner, Ellie, the young waitress, approached hesitantly. She clutched her notepad tightly, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and admiration. "Mr. McGraw," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "That was incredible. I didn't know you could do that." Hank gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Just an old habit," he said. "Nothing special." Ellie shook her head vigorously. "Are you kidding? You stood up to them like it was nothing. Everyone's been too scared to say anything, and you just—" She stopped herself, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "Sorry. I just mean, thank you for standing up for us." Hank's smile softened. You don't need to thank me. Just doing what needed to be done." Ellie glanced toward the door, where the gang had made their exit. "Do you think they'll come back?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The sheriff answered before Hank could. "They'll be back," Dalton said grimly. "Snake doesn't take humiliation lightly. They'll want to make an example out of someone." Hank's eyes narrowed. "Let them come," he said quietly. "This time, they'll know exactly what they're walking into." Dalton frowned, concern etched across his face. "Hank, I appreciate what you did, but this isn't your fight. These men are dangerous. They've got connections, guns, muscle. You can't take them all on by yourself." Hank met the sheriff's gaze, his expression unreadable. "Maybe not," he admitted. "But I've faced worse odds." The sheriff sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "I figured you'd say that," he muttered. "Just don't go getting yourself killed. This town needs folks like you." Hank's lips twitched in the faintest hint of a smile. "Don't worry, Dalton. I'm not planning on going anywhere." As the sheriff rose from the table, Hank turned his attention back to Ellie. "You should head home," he told her gently. "It's not safe to be out late, not with men like that around." Ellie hesitated, her brow furrowed. "What about you?" she asked. "Aren't you worried?" Hank shook his head. "Not much scares me these days." Her lips pressed together, as if she wanted to argue, but instead, she nodded. "Be careful, Mr. McGraw," she said before retreating to the counter. Hank watched her go, his thoughts churning. The truth was, he hadn't come back to this quiet town just for peace. He'd come because he wanted to rebuild a life away from the shadows of his past. But now, those shadows seemed determined to follow him, no matter where he went. Dalton lingered by the door, tipping his hat to Hank before stepping outside. The sheriff's squad car rumbled to life, its taillights disappearing into the distance. For a moment, Hank sat alone, his mind replaying the events of the day. He thought about Snake and his crew, their arrogance and bravado masking the deeper truth. They'd never faced real danger before, but they would soon. Hank sighed, finishing his coffee and placing a few bills on the table. He stood, adjusting the brim of his hat, and walked toward the door. Outside, the cool evening air greeted him, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and earth. The streets were quiet, the small town already retreating into the safety of their homes. As he headed back to his truck, a single thought echoed in his mind. If Snake and his gang wanted a fight, they'd get one, but it wouldn't be the kind they were expecting. The sun dipped below the horizon as Hank's truck rolled down the dirt road toward his farmhouse, the headlights cutting through the deepening twilight. The rhythmic hum of the tires against the gravel was almost soothing, but Hank's mind was far from restful. His thoughts wandered back to the diner, to the fear in Ellie's voice, and to Snake's parting words. This ain't over. The farmhouse came into view, a modest structure surrounded by sprawling fields that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. Hank pulled into the driveway, the truck's engine sputtering to a stop. As he stepped out, the cool night air enveloped him, carrying the faint rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl. This was home, a sanctuary he'd worked hard to build after years of chaos. But now it felt like a fortress preparing for a siege. Inside, Hank flipped on the lights, their warm glow illuminating the simple, comfortable interior. The walls were adorned with faded photographs, snapshots of a life long past. One frame in particular caught his eye, a black and white image of a younger Hank in his military uniform, standing tall and resolute alongside his platoon. His gaze lingered on the photo, a flood of memories washing over him. The knock at the door pulled him back to the present. Hank's instincts kicked in immediately, his hand reaching for the revolver holstered at his hip. He moved toward the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. It was Dalton. Hank opened the door, letting the sheriff in. Dalton looked tense, his face drawn with concern. "Sorry to bother you this late," he said, stepping inside. "But I thought you'd want to know. Snake's been seen at a roadhouse just outside town. Word is he's rallying more men." Hank nodded, his expression unreadable. "Figured he wouldn't let this go." Dalton leaned against the wall, enfolding his arms. "I don't like this, Hank. These aren't just some rowdy punks. Snake's crew has ties to bigger operations, smuggling, trafficking. They're well-funded and well-armed. If they're targeting you, it's not going to be a fair fight." Hank's lips curved into a faint smirk. "It never is." Dalton sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Look, I know you're capable, but this town doesn't need more violence. If you escalate things, people are going to get hurt, maybe worse. Hank's gaze hardened. And if I don't, Snake and his men will keep pushing. They'll hurt more people. That girl at the diner, Ellie, how long before she becomes one of their victims? Or the next shop owner who can't pay their protection fee. Someone has to stand up to them. Dalton studied Hank for a moment, then nodded reluctantly. Just be careful, he said. I've seen too many good men fall trying to fight battles that weren't theirs to fight. This one is mine, Hank replied quietly. Dalton left shortly after, leaving Hank alone with his thoughts. The house was silent, save for the faint creak of the floorboards under his boots. Hank moved to the small workbench in the corner of the living room, pulling open a drawer. Inside was a well-worn leather case. He opened it, revealing a meticulously maintained rifle, its polished barrel gleaming in the light. Hank ran his fingers along the weapon, the familiar weight grounding him. This rifle had seen him through countless battles, a silent partner in his fight for survival. Now, it would serve him again, not on foreign soil, but on the land he'd come to call home. The following morning, word of Snake's movements spread quickly through the town. At the diner, Ellie overheard two farmers discussing the rumors of a larger gang gathering on the outskirts. Their voices were hushed, but the fear was evident. Snake's got reinforcements, one of them said. He's planning something big. Reckon the sheriff can handle it, the other asked. The first man shook his head. Not if Snake's bringing in outsiders. We're gonna need more than a badge and a gun to stop them. Ellie's heart raced as she hurried to the back of the diner, pulling out her phone. She hesitated before dialing, then hit the call button. Mr. McGraw, she said when Hank answered. You need to know they're planning something. I heard they've got more men coming. I figured, Hank replied, his voice calm. Thanks for letting me know, Ellie. You stay safe, you hear? Yes, sir, she said, though her voice trembled. Are you too? Meanwhile, on the outskirts of town, Snake stood outside the roadhouse addressing a growing group of men. They were a motley crew, bikers, drifters, and outlaws, drawn by the promise of easy money and the thrill of a fight. This ain't just about one old man, Snake growled, pacing in front of them. This is about sending a message. No one disrespects us and gets away with it. Scar nodded in agreement, though his face betrayed a flicker of doubt. You sure about this, ye Snake? That old man, he ain't normal. Snake shot him a glare. He's one man, we're 20. Do the math. The group erupted in cheers, their bravado masking the unease that lingered among some of them. Snake's determination was infectious, but the stories about Hank McGraw, the Phantom of the Plains, had shaken even the most hardened criminals. As the gang prepared for their assault, the stage was set for a showdown unlike anything the town had seen. Snake's arrogance and Hank's resolve would soon collide, and the quiet streets of the small Texas town would become a battlefield. The early morning sun cast long shadows over the fields as Hank stood on his porch, staring out at the horizon. His coffee sat untouched on the railing beside him, steam curling into the cool air. The calm of the morning felt deceptive, a fragile peace that could shatter at any moment. His mind drifted to the voices of the past. Friends lost in battles fought far away, their words a reminder of the sacrifices made. "And do what's right, Hank," one voice seemed to whisper, "even when it's hard." But the weight of doing what was right often came with a cost, one he was no stranger to paying. Hank's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a car approaching. A dusty sedan pulled up the gravel driveway, and Ellie stepped out hesitantly. Her hands were clasped tightly, and her face was pale but resolute. She looked out of place in the rugged landscape, her diner uniform a stark contrast to the wild fields and open skies. "What are you doing here, Ellie?" Hank asked as she made her way up the steps. "I had to come," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I couldn't sit at the diner and pretend like everything's fine. I overheard more talk this morning. Snake's men are planning to come back tonight, and it sounds like they're bringing everyone they've got." Hank studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You should be at home, Ellie. This isn't your fight." Ellie shook her head, her eyes brimming with determination. "It is my fight, Mr. McGraw. This is my town, my home. I can't just stand by and let them tear it apart, and neither should you." Hank's jaw tightened, and he looked away, the weight of her words pressing against his conscience. He had come to this town to escape, to leave behind the violence and chaos of his past, but it seemed fate had other plans. "Ellie," he said finally, his voice softer. "Standing up to men like Snake, it's not as simple as it looks. It's dangerous. People get hurt. People die. I know that," she said, stepping closer. "But what's the alternative? Let them keep taking and hurting until there's nothing left. Someone has to stop them, and you're the only one who can." Her words cut through Hank's defenses, striking at the heart of his internal struggle. He had spent years running from the responsibility that came with his skills, trying to convince himself that he could live a quiet, ordinary life. But deep down, he knew that wasn't who he was. Hank sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "You've got guts, kid. I'll give you that." Ellie managed a small smile, though her hands still trembled. "I just don't want to lose what we have here. This town is worth fighting for." Before Hank could respond, another car pulled into the driveway. This time, it was Dalton. The sheriff stepped out, his expression grim as he approached the porch. "Morning," Dalton said, nodding to Ellie before turning to Hank. "I've got news. Snake's crew is gathering at the old mill on the edge of town. They're planning to roll in after dark." Hank's eyes narrowed. "How many?" "Too many," Dalton admitted. "At least 20, maybe more. They're loaded up with guns and looking for a fight." Hank glanced at Ellie, then back at Dalton. "And what's your plan?" Dalton sighed heavily. "Truth is, I don't have one. I've called in backup from the next county over, but they won't get here in time. We're on our own." A heavy silence settled over the porch as the three of them considered their options. Ellie's courage was admirable, but Hank knew she wasn't prepared for what was coming. And Dalton, for all his good intentions, was outnumbered and outgunned. "I'll handle it," Hank said finally, his voice steady. Dalton frowned. "Hank, you don't have to do this alone." "Yes, I do," Hank replied. "You've got a town to protect, Dalton. Keep the people safe. I'll take care of Snake and his men." Dalton hesitated, torn between his duty as a sheriff and his concern for Hank. "You sure about this?" Hank nodded. "It's what I do." Ellie stepped forward, her expression a mix of fear and determination. "You're not going alone," she said firmly. "If this is happening, I'm helping." "No," Hank said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You're staying here. The last thing I need is to worry about keeping you safe." "But, no," Hank repeated, his gaze softening slightly. "You've got a lot of fight in you, Ellie, but this isn't your battle. Stay with Dalton, help him keep the town safe." Ellie opened her mouth to argue, but stopped when she saw the resolve in Hank's eyes. Instead, she nodded reluctantly, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. As the sun climbed higher into the sky, Hank turned to Dalton. "Get the word out. Tell folks to stay inside tonight and lock their doors. And if you hear anything at all, you let me know." Dalton nodded. "You'll hear from me." Hank watched them leave, his mind already shifting into battle mode. Tonight, he would face Snake and his gang alone. It wasn't the life he had chosen, but it was the life he knew. And if he could protect this town from the darkness threatening to consume it, then it was a fight worth taking. As the afternoon shadows grew long and the day inched toward dusk, Hank moved with purpose through his small farmhouse. The air inside was heavy with the scent of old wood and gun oil. Each movement was deliberate, a man reconnecting with tools he hadn't touched in years. On the table lay his most prized possession, a Winchester rifle, its barrel gleaming as he meticulously cleaned it. Next to it, a pair of revolvers rested in their holsters, ready to be strapped on. From a worn leather box, Hank pulled out a faded photograph. It showed a younger version of himself in military fatigues, standing with his unit, their faces hardened but proud. His fingers lingered over the image as a flood of memories washed over him. Friends lost, battles fought, and a vow made to never return to that life. But sometimes, the world didn't give you a choice. The stillness was interrupted by the soft creak of a floorboard. Hank's hand instinctively went to the revolver at his side, drawing it with the speed of a striking snake. "It's just me," a voice said, calm but wary. Dalton stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands, looking more weary than ever. "So you're supposed to be back in town," Hank said, holstering the gun but not relaxing his stance. "I will be," Dalton replied, "but I figured you could use a second pair of eyes tonight." Hank studied the sheriff for a long moment before nodding. "You've got a family, Dalton. You sure you want to risk it?" Dalton's expression hardened. This is my town, Hank, my people. I can't just stand back while you put your life on the line for us. Fair enough, Hank said, motioning for Dalton to take a seat. Let's go over the plan. By the time night fell, the farmhouse was cloaked in darkness. The only light came from the moon, its silvery glow casting an eerie pall over the fields. From the second-story window, Hank surveyed the landscape. In the distance, a faint rumble grew louder. The unmistakable sound of engines carried on the wind, a foreboding symphony of motorcycles and trucks. "They're coming," Dalton said, his voice low but steady. Hank nodded, his eyes narrowing as he watched the convoy approach. They think they're unstoppable. That makes them predictable. Downstairs, the farmhouse was fortified. Windows were barricaded, and furniture was stacked against doors. Hank had set up traps in the yard. Simple but effective measures meant to slow the gang's advance and sow confusion. As the rumble grew louder, Hank turned to Dalton. "Remember, this isn't about fighting them head-on. It's about making them realize they've bitten off more than they can chew. Stay sharp and don't hesitate." Dalton gave a curt nod, his hand resting on the shotgun slung over his shoulder. "Understood." The first truck rolled into view, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Behind it came the motorcycles, their engines roaring like a pack of wolves. Snake himself was easy to spot, riding at the head of the group on a gleaming Harley. His silhouette was imposing, his long coat billowing in the wind as he led his men toward the farmhouse. "Let's see what they're made of," Hank muttered under his breath. The convoy came to a halt just outside the fence line. Snake dismounted, his boots crunching against the gravel. He scanned the farmhouse, his sharp eyes catching the faint glint of a rifle barrel in the upstairs window. "Hank McGraw!" Snake's voice boomed, carrying across the field. "We know you're in there. Come out and make this easy on yourself." Hank didn't respond. Instead, he adjusted his rifle's sights, his finger hovering over the trigger. "Nothing," Snake said, a smirk playing on his lips. He turned to his men. "Looks like he's trying to play tough. Let's show him what happens when you mess with us." The gang began to fan out, their movements methodical. But as they crossed into the yard, the first trap was sprung. A hidden tripwire sent one of the bikers sprawling, his fall triggering a small explosion that sent dirt and debris flying. "Ambush!" one of the men shouted, panic creeping into his voice. Snake snarled, his smirk replaced by a scowl. "Stay calm. He's just one old man. Spread out and find him." From his vantage point, Hank picked off the first man with precision. A shot rang out, and the biker dropped to the ground, clutching his leg. Chaos erupted as the gang scrambled for cover. Dalton, stationed near the back door, fired a warning shot into the air. "You're surrounded," he shouted, his voice steady. "Walk away now, and no one else gets hurt." Snake's laugh cut through the night. "Surrounded by what? 2 old men and some rusty guns. Boys, let's show them who's really in charge." But as the gang pressed forward, they found themselves outmaneuvered at every turn. Each step closer to the farmhouse brought another trap or a well-placed shot. Hank and Dalton moved like shadows, their actions precise and coordinated. As the chaos unfolded, Snake's confidence began to waver. His men, once so eager to follow his lead, were now hesitant, their fear growing with each passing moment. The realization was sinking in. They weren't dealing with an ordinary farmer and sheriff. They were up against something far more dangerous. The tension reached a boiling point as Snake regrouped with the remnants of his crew. His gaze shifted to the farmhouse, where Hank stood silhouetted in the upstairs window, his rifle steady. "Come on, Snake," Hank called out, his voice carrying a chilling calm. "Let's see if you got the guts to finish what you started." The standoff in the moonlit yard continued, with Snake and his remaining gang huddling behind their motorcycles and trucks. The air was thick with tension, broken only by the occasional creak of wood from the farmhouse or the whisper of the wind through the fields. Inside, Hank's mind worked quickly, assessing the situation and calculating the next move. Dalton, crouched near the kitchen door with his shotgun at the ready, glanced toward Hank. "They're spooked, but Snake's not going to give up this easily. He's got too much pride." Hank nodded, his lips set in a grim line. "He's trying to figure out how to save face without losing control of his men. Pride like that can be a weakness." Outside, Snake lit a cigar, the ember glowing like a predator's eye in the dark. He took a long drag, his face tightening with frustration. He'd underestimated the old man badly. Turning to his men, he growled, "Spread out, flank the house. He's got to run out of tricks eventually." The gang hesitated, their earlier bravado replaced by wariness. Snake's lieutenant, a wiry man named Blade with a jagged scar across his cheek, spoke up. "Boss, this ain't like the others. That old man's got skills. Maybe we cut our losses." Snake rounded on him, his eyes blazing. "You questioning me, Blade?" Blade held his ground but didn't press further. Snake's authority was hanging by a thread, and everyone knew it. The gang fanned out reluctantly, moving through the shadows like predators circling prey. Inside the farmhouse, Hank kept a close eye on their movements. From his perch upstairs, he saw one of the outlaws trying to slip through the side of the barn. Hank let out a low whistle to signal Dalton, who moved swiftly to intercept. Dalton caught the outlaw off guard, his shotgun raised. "Drop it," he ordered, his voice steady. The man hesitated, his hands trembling as he considered reaching for his weapon. Dalton took a step closer. "I won't say it again." The outlaw's gun clattered to the ground, and Dalton gestured for him to back away. "Go tell your friends to leave while they still can." The man nodded, his face pale as he retreated into the night. Dalton exhaled, his grip on the shotgun tightening. He hadn't fired a weapon in years, and the tension was taking its toll. But as he returned to the house, he felt a surge of determination. If Hank could stand firm, so could he. Meanwhile, Snake decided to change tactics. He called out to Hank, his voice dripping with mockery. "You think you can keep this up all night, old man? We've got the numbers and you're running out of options." Hank stepped into the moonlight, his silhouette framed by the upstairs window. His calm demeanor was unshaken. Numbers don't mean much when they're too scared to fight. Snake's jaw clenched as his men shifted uneasily. He could feel the tide turning, his control slipping away. Desperate to regain the upper hand, he gestured for two of his men to advance toward the house under cover of darkness. The outlaws crept forward, their movements cautious as they neared the front porch. But Hank had anticipated the maneuver. As soon as they reached the steps, the floorboards gave way beneath them, sending the men tumbling into a concealed pit. A cloud of dust rose, followed by groans of pain and curses. Snake's face twisted with rage. "Get them out of there!" he barked. But no one moved. His men were paralyzed, their earlier confidence shattered. Hank's voice cut through the chaos. "I've seen your kind before, Snake, bullies who think fear is power. But you're learning the hard way that real power comes from standing up to people like you." Inside, Dalton watched the scene unfold with a mix of awe and unease. "You've got them rattled, Hank. But what's your end game? They're not just going to walk away." Hank turned to him, his green eyes hard as steel. "They will if we push them far enough. This isn't just about running them off tonight. It's about sending a message to them and anyone else who thinks they can come here and do the same." Dalton nodded, understanding the weight of Hank's words. This wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a battle for the soul of their town. And Hank wasn't just defending his home, he was defending everything the community stood for. As the night wore on, Snake's frustration boiled over. He grabbed a rifle from one of his men and aimed it at the farmhouse. "You want to play games, old man? Let's see how you handle this." The shot rang out, shattering a window on the second floor. Hank ducked instinctively, but instead of returning fire, he picked up his rifle and took aim at the truck behind Snake. With a single shot, he hit the gas tank, sending a plume of smoke into the air. The explosion lit up the night, casting the yard in a fiery glow. Snake and his men scattered, their confidence completely eroded. Hank stepped back into the shadows, his voice calm but firm. "That was a warning. Next time, it won't be the truck." The gang regrouped at the edge of the property, their numbers dwindling and their morale in tatters. Snake paced furiously, his mind racing for a way to salvage the situation. But as he glanced back at his men, he saw the fear in their eyes. They weren't just afraid of Hank, they were beginning to doubt Snake himself. "Boss," Blade said quietly, his voice barely audible, "maybe we call it, this isn't worth it." Snake glared at him but didn't respond. Deep down, he knew Blade was right. They had come here expecting an easy target, but they had found something far more formidable. And for the first time, Snake began to question his own judgment. The stage was set for a final confrontation. The outlaws were fractured, their leader desperate, and the farmhouse stood as a beacon of resistance. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the tension reached its breaking point. The first rays of dawn cast a pale light over the battlefield that had been Hank's quiet homestead just hours before. The soft morning haze mingled with the remnants of smoke rising from the destroyed truck, creating an eerie scene that made Snake's gang look like ghosts of their former selves. The outlaws stood huddled near the edge of the property, their bravado diminished and their faces etched with exhaustion and doubt. Snake, however, was a man on the edge, his pride refusing to let him admit defeat. Hank observed them from the second-floor window, his sharp eyes scanning every movement. Despite his calm demeanor, he felt the weight of the night pressing on his shoulders. He knew that the longer this dragged on, the greater the risk to Dalton and the farm. He needed to end this decisively and without further bloodshed if possible. Dalton, leaning against the wall with his shotgun, broke the silence. They're cornered, Hank. Desperate. That makes them dangerous. Desperation can make men reckless, Hank replied, his voice steady. But it also makes them predictable. They'll try one last move to save face. Outside, Snake was doing exactly that. He barked orders at his remaining men, his voice hoarse with frustration. We're not leaving with our tails between our legs. That old man's just one guy. He can't hold us off forever. Blade stepped forward, his expression grim. Boss, look around. Half our guys are gone. The rest are scared out of their minds, and we've lost every advantage we had. This ain't a fight, it's a suicide mission. Snake turned on Blade, grabbing him by the collar. You questioning me? You think you can do better? Then go ahead, take the lead. Blade pushed Snake's hands off, his voice low but firm. I'm saying we cut our losses while we still can. That old man's not just some farmer. He's a damn force of nature, and we're not equipped to deal with him. Snake glared at him, but the defiance in Blade's eyes forced him to release his grip. Turning away, Snake tried to regain control of the situation. He couldn't afford to let his men see him falter. Not now. Hank watched their exchange through his rifle scope, noting the growing fractures in the gang's unity. He decided it was time to exploit their doubt. Stepping onto the front porch, Hank called out, his voice carrying across the yard with quiet authority. Snake, you've had your fun, but it's over. Take your men and leave while you still can. The next move you make will be your last. The outlaws froze, their eyes darting between Snake and the farmhouse. Hank's words weren't a threat. They were a statement of fact. Even the faintest hint of hesitation in Snake's response would seal his fate as a leader. Snake clenched his fists, his pride warring with his survival instincts. You think you can scare me off, old man? I've faced worse than you. Hank's expression didn't change. Maybe you have, but I'm not bluffing. You know it, and so do your men. The tension in the air was palpable as Snake struggled to maintain control. He turned to his men, trying to rally them. We came here to make a statement. Are you all just going to run because some old man knows how to shoot? Blade stepped forward again, this time addressing the group. He's not just an old man, Snake. He's smarter than us, better trained, and he's been 10 steps ahead all night. If we stay here, we're dead. You can stay if you want, but I'm done. One by one, the remaining outlaws lowered their weapons and backed away, their loyalty to Snake dissolving under the weight of reason. Snake's face twisted with rage and desperation as he watched his authority crumble before his eyes. Inside the farmhouse, Dalton let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. They're breaking ranks, Hank. Looks like you got through to them. Not all of them, Hank replied, his gaze fixed on Snake. There's always one who doesn't know when to quit. Snake, now standing alone in the yard, gripped his rifle tightly. His men were gone, his power shattered, but his pride refused to let him retreat. He pointed the gun toward the farmhouse, his hands trembling with frustration and rage. Hank stepped off the porch, his rifle slung over his shoulder. He moved with the calm precision of a man who had faced far greater threats. You're alone, Snake. Walk away. No one else needs to get hurt. Snake's laugh was hollow, almost manic. You think you've won, old man? You think I'm just going to walk away after this? Hank stopped a few paces away, his expression unyielding. This isn't about winning or losing. It's about survival. And right now you have one choice left. Make it. Snake raised his rifle, his hands unsteady, but before he could pull the trigger, Hank moved with lightning speed, his hand darting to his hip. The crack of Hank's revolver split the air, and Snake's rifle flew from his hands, the bullet striking the barrel with pinpoint accuracy. Snake staggered back, clutching his hand as the rifle clattered to the ground. He looked up at Hank, his face pale and his eyes wide with disbelief. You could have killed me." Hank holstered his revolver, his voice steady. "If I wanted you dead, you'd already be in the ground. Now get off my land." Snake hesitated, his pride urging him to make one last stand, but the pain in his hand and the icy determination in Hank's eyes made it clear. This fight was over. He turned and stumbled toward his bike, the weight of his failure hanging heavy on his shoulders. As Snake rode away, the first light of day fully illuminated the farm. Hank stood motionless for a moment, the quiet returning like a blanket after a storm. Dalton joined him on the porch, his voice filled with awe. "You did it, Hank. You took them down without spilling a drop of blood." Hank gave a small nod, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Sometimes, the hardest fights are the ones where you don't pull the trigger." The sun had fully risen now, casting a golden light over the farm as Hank and Dalton stood on the porch, watching Snake disappear down the dusty road. The quiet was almost unsettling after the tension-filled night, but both men knew the danger wasn't entirely over. Snake might have been driven off, but there was no guarantee he wouldn't regroup and come back with more men, more firepower, and an even greater thirst for vengeance. Dalton leaned against the porch railing, his shotgun resting beside him. "Think he'll stay gone?" His voice carried a mix of hope and doubt. Hank, still scanning the horizon, shook his head slightly. "Men like Snake don't know how to back down. He's humiliated, and he'll want to reclaim his pride. But next time he'll be smarter and angrier." Dalton sighed, running a hand through his hair. "So, what do we do? Just wait for him to show up again?" Hank turned to face Dalton, his expression resolute. "No, we make sure he doesn't get the chance." As the morning wore on, Hank and Dalton began preparing for what they both knew was inevitable. While the farm had weathered the night's assault, there was still work to be done to ensure it could stand up to another attack. Hank led Dalton through the fields, pointing out areas that needed reinforcing and sharing tips on setting up defenses. "You've got good instincts, Dalton," Hank said as they secured the barn's entrances. "But instincts need to be sharpened. The more prepared you are, the less you'll have to rely on them." Dalton nodded, absorbing every word. Though he'd grown up on a farm, he'd never imagined he'd have to defend it like this. But seeing Hank's calm determination gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Meanwhile, Snake's retreat wasn't the end of the story. As he roared down the highway, his mind churned with anger and humiliation. His hand throbbed from where Hank's bullet had grazed it, a constant reminder of his failure. He pulled into a rundown gas station on the outskirts of town, where a few of his remaining men were waiting. Blade approached him cautiously, his eyes scanning Snake's face for any sign of reason. "Are you okay, boss?" Snake shoved past him, heading for a table littered with maps and weapons. "No, I'm not okay," he growled. "That old man made fools of us, and I'm not letting him get away with it." Blade hesitated, his voice low. "Boss, maybe it's time to cut our losses. We've already lost half the crew. Going back there could what?" Snake snapped, his voice rising. "Make us look weak. Let everyone know some washed-up farmer beat the chrome serpents. Not a chance. We're going back, and this time we're not holding back." Blade exchanged a glance with Tank, who stood silently in the corner, his massive frame slouched as if the weight of the night's events had finally caught up with him. But neither man dared to challenge Snake further. The gang was fracturing, but Snake's fury was holding them together barely. Back at the farm, Hank and Dalton continued their preparations. They reinforced the windows and doors, laid traps around the perimeter, and even fashioned a few decoys to mislead the outlaws if they returned. Hank's military expertise was evident in every detail, from the placement of barricades to the positioning of weapons. As they worked, Hank shared stories from his time in the service, lessons learned in the heat of battle that had stayed with him long after the fighting was over. "You know," Hank said, pausing to adjust a tripwire, "it's not about being the strongest or the fastest. It's about staying calm under pressure, thinking 3 steps ahead, and using your enemy's weaknesses against them." Dalton listened intently, his respect for Hank growing with each passing moment. For the first time, he began to see the older man not just as a mentor, but as a symbol of resilience and strength. The sun dipped lower in the sky as the day wore on, painting the horizon in hues of orange and gold. The farm, now fortified and ready, seemed almost peaceful in the fading light. But Hank knew better than to trust appearances. He stood on the porch, his rifle in hand, watching the road for any sign of movement. It didn't take long for his instincts to be proven right. A faint rumble in the distance grew louder, the unmistakable sound of motorcycles tearing through the countryside. Hank's jaw tightened as he raised his rifle and called out to Dalton, "They're coming!" Dalton joined him on the porch, his shotgun at the ready. "How many?" Hank squinted into the distance, counting the dark shapes against the setting sun. "Looks like Snake brought reinforcements. We're outnumbered, but we've got the advantage here. Stick to the plan, and we'll be fine." Dalton nodded, his grip tightening on his weapon. "I'm with you, Hank." As the outlaws approached, Snake rode at the front, his face twisted with determination. Behind him, a ragtag group of bikers followed, their expressions ranging from nervous to defiant. Snake pulled his bike to a stop at the edge of the property, his men spreading out behind him. "Hank!" Snake shouted, his voice carrying over the still evening air. "You had your fun last night, but this ends now. You come out here or we're coming in." Hank stepped forward, his rifle slung over his shoulder. He stopped just short of the fence line, his calm demeanor unshaken. "You're making a mistake, Snake. Turn around now, and you can walk away. But if you cross that line, you won't walk out." Snake's laugh was harsh and grating. "Big words for one man against 20. You think you can stop us?" Hank's eyes narrowed. "I don't think, Snake." "I know." Snake dismounted his bike, his boots crunching against the gravel as he advanced toward the fence line. Behind him, his gang shifted uneasily, their confidence tempered by the memory of the night before. Some exchanged wary glances, silently questioning their decision to follow Snake into the fray once more. Blade hung back, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol but without conviction, while Tank kept his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Hank stood his ground, his posture relaxed but alert, like a coiled spring ready to strike. Dalton remained just behind him, his shotgun raised and his face set with determination. The fortified farm, bathed in the golden light of dusk, seemed to stand as a silent testament to their readiness. Snake stopped a few feet from the fence, his face twisted with a mixture of anger and desperation. "You think you're clever, old man?" he snarled. "Last night was just the beginning. This time we're not playing games." Hank tilted his head slightly, his calm gaze fixed on Snake. "You've already lost, Snake. You just don't realize it yet." Snake's eyes flashed with fury. "You talk a big game, but there's only 2 of you. I've got 20 men, and we're armed to the teeth. What do you think is going to happen when we come through that fence?" Hank's lips twitched into a faint smile. "You'll wish you hadn't." Without another word, Snake raised his hand, signaling his men to advance. The outlaws hesitated for a brief moment, their earlier bravado wavering as they eyed the farm's defenses. But Snake's barked command, "Move!" spurred them into action, and they surged forward in a chaotic wave. The moment they crossed the fence line, Hank gave a sharp whistle. Instantly, the first of the farm's traps sprang to life. A tripwire hidden in the tall grass triggered a series of small explosive charges, sending plumes of dirt and smoke into the air. Several outlaws stumbled, their advance halted as confusion rippled through their ranks. From his position on the porch, Dalton opened fire, his shotgun roaring as he targeted the nearest bikers. The blasts were precise, forcing the attackers to scatter and seek cover behind their bikes and the few remaining trees along the property line. Hank, meanwhile, took aim with his rifle, each shot methodical and deliberate. He didn't waste bullets. Every pull of the trigger sent another outlaw's weapon flying from their hands or forced them to retreat further back. The chaos sowed by the traps and the precision of Hank and Dalton's defense quickly turned the tide of the battle. Snake, crouched behind a fallen tree, cursed under his breath as he watched his men falter. "What are you waiting for?" he shouted. "Push forward. They can't hold us off forever." But the outlaws were no longer listening. The farm's defenses had turned the open yard into a gauntlet, and the memory of the previous night's humiliation was fresh in their minds. Blade approached Snake, his voice low but firm. "We can't win this, Cow Snake. We need to fall back." Snake spun on him, his face red with rage. "You think I'm just going to walk away after everything? No. I'll end this myself." Before Blade could respond, Snake grabbed a shotgun from a fallen comrade and charged toward the farmhouse, his rage blinding him to the danger. Hank watched him come, his rifle steady in his hands. He could see the desperation in Snake's eyes. the reckless determination that marked a man with nothing left to lose. As Snake closed the distance, Hank didn't fire. Instead, he waited, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "This is your last chance, Snake. Turn back or I'll end it right here." Snake snarled, his finger tightening on the trigger. "You don't scare me, old man." But before Snake could take another step, Hank moved with lightning speed. His shot rang out, striking the ground just inches from Snake's feet. The force of the blast sent dirt and debris flying, and Snake stumbled, his balance faltering. Hank lowered his rifle slightly, his voice calm but commanding. "You've already lost, Snake." "Don't make me prove it." The outlaws, witnessing Snake's humiliation, began to retreat in earnest. Blade signaled to the others, and they mounted their bikes, revving their engines and pulling back from the farm. Tank lingered for a moment, his gaze meeting Hank's across the distance. There was no malice in his eyes, only a silent acknowledgement of defeat. With a nod, he turned and followed the others. Snake, now alone and on his knees, looked up at Hank, his face a mask of fury and shame. "You think this is over? You think you've won?" Hank stepped forward, his rifle slung over his shoulder. "It is over, Snake. You're done. And if you ever come back, you won't get another chance." Snake glared at him, but the fight had gone out of him. He stumbled to his feet, clutching his injured hand, and staggered toward his bike. As he rode away, the echoes of his defeat hung heavy in the air. Dalton joined Hank on the porch, his shotgun still in hand. "Think he'll stay gone this time?" Hank watched the horizon until Snake's silhouette disappeared. "If he's smart, he will. But if not..." He patted the barrel of his rifle. "We'll be ready." The farm fell silent once more, the tension of the battle giving way to a profound sense of calm. As the first stars appeared in the night sky, Hank and Dalton sat on the porch, their weapons by their sides, and the knowledge that they had stood their ground. The stars overhead painted a tranquil sky, their light a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded just hours earlier. The farm, though quiet now, bore the marks of the battle: disturbed earth, scattered debris, and the faint smell of gunpowder lingering in the air. Hank sat on the porch steps, his rifle resting across his knees, his face illuminated by the soft glow of a lantern. Dalton approached with a fresh pot of coffee, his steps careful as if not to disturb the peace that had finally settled. "Here," he said, pouring a steaming cup and handing it to Hank. "You earned it." Hank took the mug with a small nod of thanks, his gaze fixed on the horizon. For a moment, neither man spoke, the silence between them filled with the unspoken acknowledgement of what they had endured. "I'll admit," Dalton began, breaking the quiet, "there were times tonight I thought we were done for." Hank's lips curved into a faint smile. "A good plan can go a long way, but it's the will to see it through that matters most." Dalton nodded, his admiration for Hank evident in his expression. "You've got that in spades, old man. Can't say I've ever seen anything like it." Hank chuckled softly, the sound almost foreign after the tension of the day. "Experience, son. Life has a way of teaching you how to stand your ground, no matter the odds." The faint sound of an approaching vehicle broke their conversation. Both men tensed, their hands instinctively moving toward their weapons. But as the headlights crested the hill and illuminated the driveway, Hank relaxed. It was the sheriff's truck, its familiar silhouette bringing a sense of relief. Sheriff Hayes stepped out, his hat tilted back as he surveyed the scene. "Heard about the commotion?" he said, his voice gruff but tinged with concern. "Figured I'd come see the aftermath." Hank gestured toward the porch. "We're in one piece. That's what matters." The sheriff approached, his sharp eyes taking in the scattered evidence of the battle. "Snake and his crew?" "Gone," Hank replied simply. "For now." The sheriff frowned. "For now?" Hank shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Men like that don't learn their lesson overnight, but they'll think twice before coming back here." Sheriff Hayes leaned against the porch railing, his expression serious. "You know, Hank, I could have brought backup. We could have handled this." Hank met his gaze, his green eyes steady. "I appreciate it, but some battles are personal. They came here looking for trouble, and they found more than they bargained for." The sheriff sighed, a reluctant smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. You've always been a stubborn one." "Stubborn keeps you alive," Hank replied with a smirk. "At least out here." As the sheriff made his rounds, ensuring the area was secure, Hank turned his attention back to Dalton. "You held your own tonight," he said, his tone earnest. Dalton looked down, a hint of bashfulness in his demeanor. Just followed your lead. Wouldn't have made it without you. Hank placed a hand on Dalton's shoulder, his grip firm. You've got more in you than you think, Dalton. Tonight proved that. Dalton nodded, the weight of Hank's words sinking in. He had come to the farm seeking guidance, and tonight he had found something far more valuable, a sense of purpose and resilience. The sheriff returned to the porch, his hat in hand. Looks like you've got things under control here, but I'll keep an eye out for Snake and his gang. If they're smart, they'll steer clear of this town. They will, Hank said, his voice carrying a quiet confidence. They've seen what happens when you mess with this farm. The sheriff tipped his hat, a gesture of respect. Take care, Hank, and if you ever need backup, don't hesitate to call. Hank watched as the sheriff's truck disappeared into the night, the taillights fading into the darkness. He turned back to Dalton, who was now seated on the porch steps, staring up at the stars. You think they'll stay away? Dalton asked, his voice thoughtful. They'll stay away, Hank replied firmly, but that doesn't mean we stop being ready. Life's full of challenges, Dalton. The trick is facing them head-on and standing your ground when it matters most. Dalton smiled, his respect for Hank deepening with every word. Guess I couldn't have picked a better place to learn. Hank chuckled, the sound warm and genuine. You'll do just fine, son. Just remember, strength isn't about who's the loudest or the toughest. It's about who stands firm when the time comes. The two men sat in companionable silence as the night deepened, the stars overhead a reminder of the vastness of the world and their small but significant place within it. The farm, once a symbol of peace disrupted, had become a beacon of resilience and resolve. As the lantern's light flickered and the cool night air settled in, Hank leaned back in his chair, a sense of quiet satisfaction washing over him. He had faced the storm and emerged stronger, a reminder that even in the face of adversity, a steadfast heart could prevail. With the farm quiet once more, Hank and Dalton turned in for the night, their minds at ease for the first time in days. Outside, the land stretched out in peaceful stillness, a testament to the strength and courage that had defended it. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, one thing was clear. The farm, and the men who called it home, would stand strong against whatever challenges came their way. The morning light broke gently over the farm, casting a golden glow across the fields. The aftermath of the previous night's events seemed like a distant memory as the world woke to a new day. Birds chirped in the trees, their melodies a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded just hours before. The farmhouse stood strong, its windows reflecting the sunlight, a silent testament to resilience. Hank stepped out onto the porch, his coffee cup in hand, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp. He scanned the horizon, taking in the tranquil scene with a sense of pride. The farm had weathered many storms, but last night had been one of its greatest tests. Inside, Dalton moved through the kitchen, the smell of bacon and eggs filling the air. He carried 2 plates to the table on the porch, setting them down with a grin. Figured I'd cook breakfast for a change, he said. Hank raised an eyebrow, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Don't let this go to your head, but it smells pretty good. Dalton chuckled as he took a seat beside Hank. Coming from you, that's high praise. The two men shared a quiet meal, the unspoken bond between them stronger than ever. Dalton had proven himself the night before, and Hank had seen in him the potential for greatness. They were no longer just farmer and apprentice. They were partners, united by the trials they had faced. As the sun climbed higher, Sheriff Hayes pulled into the driveway. He stepped out of his truck, his hat tilted against the morning light, and approached the porch. "Morning," he called out, his tone lighter than it had been the previous evening. "Morning, Sheriff," Hank replied, gesturing toward an empty chair. "Coffee's hot if you want some." The sheriff accepted the offer, sitting down and pouring himself a cup. "Just came by to check in," he said, his gaze sweeping over the property. "Looks like everything's in order." "Thanks to you spreading the word," Hank replied. "Snake and his gang won't be showing their faces around here any time soon." The sheriff nodded, his expression serious. "They'll think twice before messing with this place, that's for sure. But if they're smart, they'll steer clear of this whole county." Dalton leaned forward, his curiosity getting the better of him. "You really think they're gone for good?" The sheriff glanced at him, then back at Hank. "Men like Snake don't give up easily, but they also know when they've been beaten. Last night sent a message. This farm isn't an easy target. Hank sipped his coffee, his expression thoughtful. It doesn't hurt to stay prepared. Life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect it. The sheriff chuckled, tipping his hat. Spoken like a man who's seen his fair share of trouble. As the sheriff drove away, the weight of the night's events began to lift. The farm felt alive again, its fields bathed in sunlight, the promise of a new season in the air. Hank and Dalton stood side by side, surveying the land they had fought so hard to protect. "You ever think about leaving this place?" Dalton asked, his voice quiet. Hank shook his head, a small smile playing on his lips. "This farm's more than just land and buildings. It's a part of me. My father built it with his own hands, and I've spent my life keeping it strong. It's my legacy." Dalton nodded, his respect for Hank growing with each passing moment. "Guess that makes me part of it now, too." Hank clapped a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm. "You're more than a part of it, son. You're the future." As the day wore on, the two men worked side by side, repairing the damage from the previous night. The fields stretched out before them, a reminder of the hard work and dedication that kept the farm alive. And though the scars of the battle remained, they were a testament to the strength and courage that had defended this place. By evening, the farm was quiet once more, the stars overhead casting their light on a world at peace. Hank sat on the porch, his rifle resting beside him, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Dalton joined him, a sense of contentment settling over them both. "You think we'll ever have a quiet season?" Dalton asked, a hint of humor in his tone. Hank chuckled, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "Quiet's overrated, keeps you on your toes." Dalton laughed, the sound ringing out into the night. "Guess I'd better get used to it. This story may be over, but the lessons it leaves behind are timeless. Courage, resilience, and standing up for what's right. These values define more than just a man, they define a legacy. If this tale inspired you, there's more where that came from. Make sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story of courage and determination. And don't stop here. Click on one of the videos on your screen for more incredible tales that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Thank you for watching, and remember, the quietest strength often leaves the loudest echo.